little laser and yeah, okay. We're a business. So thanks for having me. I'm Hadley Dynak, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the past, the present, and the future of Western Rose Garden. I'm the current owner. We, as was just shared, purchased the property in September of 2021. This is my husband. He and I are the lead owners, supported by our two gorgeous daughters. On the right, Stella and Simone. Stella's in LA right now. She lives just outside of West Hollywood, and we just got text saying that there's a new fire that started there this evening. So that's kind of stressful. And Simone left yesterday for 4.5 months on her gap year for European adventure. So the girls are in the throes of a lot of things right now, as are Kent and I. We also have some minority partners. These are our friends, Laura Counts and Michael Mechanic. It's kind of a goofy picture of them, but they're pretty wonderful. When we bought the property, we had enough money to buy the property, but not really enough to run it for very long. It costs about $200,000 a year to run the garden, handle all of the maintenance and costs of utilities and insurance and staffing, et cetera, et cetera. So we put out a call to all of our close friends and family and said, hey, we think we're gonna buy this landmark botanical garden in Occidental. We were living in Berkeley at the time. You want to join us? And everybody said no, except for Laura and Michael. And they said, sure, we'll join you. So they're minority partners. They're only up occasionally, but it's really fun to have other people involved in what we're doing. And I think it's also consistent with the history of this place that we're talking about today. So that's me right after we bought the property. I feel that way every day. I don't think I look quite like that, unfortunately. But I'm curious, before I go much further, how many of you, show of hands, have been to Western Hills before? Oh my gosh, almost everybody, wow. And how many of you have had a conversation or knew the one set of the previous owners? Okay, wow. So I always feel really humbled when I'm in a room with people that have that experience. Stewarding this property really is meaningful for my husband and I, and we mostly are hearing through other people about the history. So if I say something wrong, feel free to correct me. I'm curious about your stories, so we can talk about those later and or share at the end. But I also wanted to say that while I'm holding a beautiful bouquet of a variety of things, largely hydrangeas, this is right after we bought the property, and literally I would walk around the greens and giggle constantly, like, what did we just do? And the reason I would do that is because I'm not a plant expert or a horticulturalist, though I am learning a lot. It's been over 3 years, and I definitely know a remarkable amount more than I did. I knew some of the plants that you were sharing, and we have a lot of those, so that was exciting for me. But my background is in running nonprofits and helping connect people to social issues and other things that matter in the world. And this place is a really perfect opportunity to bring a bunch of those skill sets together and to bring people together to have these really important conversations about what it means to have plants and people in place all together. So I thought a lot about what I wanted to share with you today. I've done a few of these presentations, and our journey has continued every time. And I was like, well, since you're plant people, you might want me to talk about the plants the most. And I've had feedback from other groups that that's something that is appreciated. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the plants to get started. This is our Japanese Zelkova serrata. It's right outside the main house. One of the kind of we call mother trees that probably was planted early days, which was 1959. It's an incredibly dense biodiverse oasis, as you can kind of see just through the pictures there. We have over 800 individual trees, about 300 different species of trees, again on 3 acres. We are, if for those that don't know, in western Sonoma County, outside about a mile outside of the town of Occidental. We also have, though they haven't been cataloged yet, about 2,000 woody shrubs and, countless more perennials, bulbs, receding annuals, etc. Here's just a few of the specimens on the collection. Lots of camellias. I think there are about 15 different species and hybrids of camellias, and they're kind of concentrated in 2 parts of the garden. The Camellia Society came out with the previous owners and cataloged them all. They're like in the top northwestern boundary and then the bottom of the garden. We have, I think, about, what did I write down, 9 different species of magnolia. So the camellias largely are blooming right now, and they're really gorgeous because they're concentrated in these 2 places, not spread about the garden. The magnolias, on the other hand, are more spread about the garden. And this one in particular is just getting ready to go. You can see like in another month or so, they're going to be going, but all of the buds are out. And this one is one of my favorites. We have also a lot of Chileans and a huge Chilean wine palm that is probably, I don't know, bigger than my arms around, like I can't, bigger than that. And probably, I don't know, 30, 40 feet tall. We also have a number of puyas. So this is the blue puya varietal, and one of the most spectacular when it blooms. It's, these long, tall stalks. The bees love them. The blue flowers with the orange stamens, and just the color combination is incredible. We didn't get one of those this year. Last year we had 5, and I don't know, you probably know more than I do about this, but I've heard rumor that they don't bloom every year, that takes a number of years for them to bloom. And so it was disappointing not to have any this year, but we felt like we had an overabundance with 5 blooming last year. We also have some interesting specimens to point out here. This is our Wollemi pine, and show of hands of people who know about the Wollemi pine. Okay, good. Then I'll tell you a little bit because not everybody does. So these pines, so they're not really pines at all, were found in the mid-90s, I think 1994, in a canyon in Australia. They were thought to be extinct, and there were fossil records of them from about 200 million years ago. So when they were found, there was a huge effort to preserve them. They were in this deep canyon, maybe even 2 canyons that they were found in, and then to get them out into the trade. And so we have 2, which we're really happy about. The people that we bought the property from got them and planted them. This is the smaller of the 2. And when we bought the property, they were both about the same size. And now this one is about half the size of the other one. The other one is growing fast and furious straight up. They're dinosaur foods. You can kind of imagine the dinosaurs munching on them as they grow up into the canyon in Australia. But here you can see, let me use my handy pointer. This is the female cone, the round ones up here, and this is the male cone. Lots of attempting to fertilize itself, to self-propagate, so that since it's not doing as well as the other one, we're wondering if maybe that's why it's got so much, I don't know what you would call it, productive seed potting going on, because the other one doesn't have that at all. So that is a pretty exciting specimen. We also have a lot of other Australians, so Banksias, lots of different Banksias, tea trees, bottle brush, grass trees, and a lot of grevillea, which I hadn't seen any grevillea ever before we bought the garden. And I'm just like astounded at their intricacy and their beauty. This is the peaches and cream varietal. We also have an endangered and rare kind of low growing, sprawling grevillea that has purple and green leaves. And that one I wrote down, it's called the Grevillea rivularis, or Carrington Falls, for where it was developed or found. And then here, this last picture, so a lot of, not a lot, but a handful of plants were actually introduced by Lester Hawkins and Marshall Olbrich, who were the founders of Western Hills Garden. And this is one of them. This is the giant Hercules calla lily. It's got spotted leaves that are huge. They can grow up to about 5 or 6 feet. And the flowers themselves also about 5 or 6 feet. So they kind of take up this entire bed. And are really striking and incredible. They're bloom. Some of them are getting ready to bloom now. And in April, if you come then, you should see a lot of them, which is pretty exciting. And they're one of those things where you look at them and you're like, wow, I've never seen anything that large that looks like that. We also have Marshall's Azalea occidentalis. That is a really beautiful azalea that has very light kind of pink and yellow flowers. And Marshall also did something called the Martha's grevillea, but it has kind of yellow orangey flowers with gray leaves, and we don't have that. So that's something that we're hoping to find. We've heard that it's in a few places up the coast, and we're going to try to get some of those in the garden. So over the last year and a half, we've had this incredible intern. Her name is Kat Britt, who's studying to be an arboriculturalist for her 3rd career at Merritt College. And her project has been to inventory the tree collection, which is why I know that we have over 800 trees, because there's very little accession data that we were given that exists for this incredible place. And we just actually applied for a grant, a federal grant, to put all of that information into a database, and then to continue to inventory all of the woody shrubs is the next part, so that we can have all the information about the collection digitized or in a digital form for our own use, for the public's use, and for how we kind of create our visitor experience. Because the number one thing people say when they come to the garden is, I don't know what any of these things are. There are no signs anywhere. So that's something that we know and we're working toward, and hopefully this grant will help us get started. But these are just a few other snapshots. This one on the left is our Eucalyptus rubida, which is a pretty rare eucalyptus. It was just cataloged by CAT as the largest Eucalyptus rubida in California. I don't think anybody had submitted any others, but there's a big trees inventory that Cal Poly maintains. And so we submitted this because she thought it was one of the biggest, and in fact it is. So we have an award winner. And it's shedding its bark, which it does every year, which is just striking. And then once the bark is shed, the tree itself is very smooth like this. So when it's just like one of those things you want to go up and like pet it, because it's just so inviting and so smooth. And we call it the white whale. Over here, we've got one of our paper bark maples on the far right, which, there has not been a lot of aesthetic or structural pruning done at Western Hills Garden. So like here, we've got, lots of different trunks that are, competing with each other. And so it's now this really interesting conversation, especially since a lot of the trees are, mature or post-mature, as to how we handle them, because we can't necessarily just cut off, big limbs, because that potentially could be introducing pathogens or hurting, the tree in other ways. So it's an ongoing struggle. The tree in the middle is one of my favorites. It's our Montezuma cypress. It's huge, and we think it's probably another one of the mother trees. And it sits alongside one of our 5 ponds called Lily's Pond. Let's see. Okay, so that's a little bit about the plants, but we can't think about plants without thinking about the people that worked on them, that put them in and that cared for them, including Kat, which I mentioned. So this is Kat with pointing up at one of the trees here yesterday at Volunteer Day. And here she is with somebody from the Aesthetic Pruning Club from Merritt College. They come out a couple times a year and help us prune our maples and our conifers. And she, has really made a huge difference in our understanding of the collection. But then, let's really, put honor where it's due with some of the original folks. Here we have Lester Hawkins with some friends, Fran Hodges and Jim Hickey. Here we have Marshall Olbrich looking very happy in the nursery. They were the first 2 owners. This is Maggie Witch. She was the 2nd owner. Up here, we have 2 men that bought the property from Maggie. Joseph Stanzel, and is that right? I'll check on that. I always forget their first and last names. So Joseph Gotta and Robert Stanzel. They didn't have the property for very long, but one of the important things that they did was introduce, make an introduction and build a partnership with the Garden Conservancy. And that partnership continues to this day. So at the time, this is Bill Noble, who was running the Garden Conservancy, and Betsy Flack, which I don't think that's actually right, because Antonia was running the Garden Conservancy, but Bill was involved. He must have been working for Antonia, and then Betsy was the kind of West Coast preservation person, and the 2 of them together helped catalog the entire kind of garden infrastructure, the bridges, the ponds, the structures, and create a map of the property, which is really important, and I'll show you a copy of that in a minute. And then Chris and Tim Sobalski, who were the people that we bought the property from right here. They had it for 11 years. So those are just a few of the original cast of characters, but many other people have been involved in pushing the garden's vision forward. And I like to think that, all of these people, along with all the other people that have been involved, are these people that take risks. They have this big dream and this idea to do something. They might not know what it is that they're setting out to do or where they're going with it, but they make an impact. And Lester and Marshall particularly, I would say, have made an impact, not only on many individuals, but also on the horticulture landscape in the Bay Area and beyond. So I've been reading, here they are, and specifically along those lines, this is Lester with Ruth Bancroft. Lester worked with her in the early days as she was planting her garden, and he made a lot of suggestions about plants she should have and design that she should do. So just an example of kind of the level of influence they had on the entire Bay Area horticulture landscape. And this is a picture of Betsy over here in early days. She spent a lot of time there throughout her life in different phases. So one of the things in addition to, kind of being what would I want to say, like being a resource, I guess, for people who were interested in this idea of a new life, taking risks, trying something new, focusing on plants, particularly plants from other parts of the world, is that they did a lot of writing. And so I have been reading a lot of their writings lately. And a lot of what they were doing is kind of pushing the idea of what landscape design was and thinking about the idea of quote unquote naturalistic design, which we could have a whole hour-long conversation about what that really means, given that they were not planting, native plants. They were bringing things in, but they were thinking about arranging them together in a naturalistic way. So I wanted to share just this little bit from Chris Rothmini, who is a notable landscape designer from LA, and she actually wrote Marshall's obituary, and this is from Marshall's obituary, about the influence that he had on the field of horticulture on his peers and also on lots of generations of gardeners. So she shared how Marshall and Lester really created this kind of haven for conversation, for activity around horticulture and garden design, but a lot of really, really hard work. She said the quote, family that lived and worked at Western Hills and the group of friends that gathered there accepted an obsessive interest in plants and gardening as normal. Our common fascination with plants was the starting point for an endless conversation that covered every subject. Somehow, without pompousness or pretension, it was assumed that art and ideas were important and that what we were doing was significant, that conventionality was less important than human consideration, that reason and imagination were as much garden tools as shovels were, and that excellence and honesty really mattered. So that brings me to the idea of place. And this is a very special place. I would say it's probably an ongoing living experiment, 67 years old-ish, 65 to 67, depending on what date you say that the garden actually started. It's a living museum that really still reflects the kernels of ideas. This is the original gate that's in our fairy ring in the garden that Lester and Marshall would invite their close friends and families through. And as we're thinking about it, this is a musing from one of Lester's many articles. This one's called Planting the Plantsman's Garden, #2. And he says, it's no doubt true that plants may serve certain useful functions and be beautiful at the same time. But I want to talk about planting as we would talk about music. When we go to a concert and simply lend ourselves to the performance. In other words, I want to reverse the usual order that starts with garden design and ends with planting. If we begin instead with plants and their association, perhaps we can then work backwards to the scheme of the garden as a whole with new insights. And I think it's just so interesting to think now, all these decades later, and you see the garden, I walk around and I'm like, I wonder what they would think of the garden right now. And we're actually getting ready to form a horticultural advisory committee so that we have some wisdom and advice from other people who know a lot more than we do about plants and this particular collection and its history, because how do you make decisions about which trees should come down? They're much bigger than they were when they were planted in the early days. What new plants do we want to introduce, and what are the thinking, the core criteria we want to use as we bring new plants in? So this is looking up from that fairy ring that I just showed you where the gate was, and it just gives you a sense of we are completely surrounded by redwoods. We are 8 miles from the coast. This is Coleman Valley Road looking toward the ocean, which is just the most beautiful drive. So when you come up, you need to take that 8-mile drive and drop down into the ocean, which is right near Bodega Bay. The climate is really temperate. So we have warm, dry summers. We have wet winters, about 60 inches of rain. I think generally they were clocking about 66 to 70 inches of rain back in the 60s and 70s. Last couple of years we've had about that. The couple of years before that, when we were in the height of the drought, obviously much less. But lots of different things can grow there from all of these different places that Lester and Marshall traveled to and brought back cuttings or seeds or developed relationships with other folks that were bringing things back and forth during those times. The other thing I think is really interesting about where we sit, the place of Western Hills Garden, is that that area in particular has always attracted these people who have kind of alternative ideas, want to take risks, try a different lifestyle, from the ranchers and farmers, who developed the area to, I love this picture, the counterculture groups that moved up in the late 60s and 70s. This is taken from Wheeler Ranch, which is just up Coleman Valley Road, is no longer is a community like this. But we have some koi from the daughter of Bill Wheeler, who just dropped by one day with the cooler full of them and asked if we wanted them, which is the kind of thing that happens on a regular basis there. It's really hard to talk about. Really hard to imagine, and then we see it. So it's just one of those places that you come to if you want to take on something new and embrace that possibility of what could happen next, which leads me to our mission, which since we're running as a nonprofit, we're working hard on, developing our values and our mission and our strategic goals. And we want to link people, plants, and place with possibility. And we want to do that to inspire hope in the future. We see this garden as an inspirational place to come to see what has been created, but also to kind of take refuge and think about what could come to catalyze new creative ideas and then provide opportunities for both small and big things to take root. This is just a quote from Mark Nepo, who is a poet, from his book, The Exquisite Risks, and he talks about the idea of story. And so that was a long introduction, talking about the plants, talking about the people a little bit, talking about the place a little bit, and didn't even scratch the surface. So what I thought I would do is give you a few specific stories that might help shed some light on some of this past 60-some years. And I'm going to start with the runnels. Runnels are a small channel that water flows through. So here are a few old pictures. This is what the property looked like when Marshall and Lester bought it. It was a big field, about, like I said, 3 acres. There was scrub oak and some redwoods and a lot of overgrowth, blackberries, and all of that. This is kind of, what was this? This is 1961. So this is just a couple years after they've been on the property. And I'm just getting ahead of myself. One of the things they did were the runnels. So here's a picture of some of the runnels recently in action. They are ditches that move water from the top of the property to the bottom of the property. We're on a slope, kind of at the top of our watershed, and they they move the water through the property, and then they connect, kind of provide the architecture or the foundation for the paths and the bridges. It's a very meandering type design, and really the runnels themselves create this framework for the garden, quote unquote, rooms that we have. Here's another picture of a couple of them and how there are bridges, because obviously they're ditches, so you have to get across them. And so we have 35 bridges that constantly need maintenance, but that are really important, beautiful features of the garden, and its elegance. This is an older version of the map. We've since updated it, but it helps you think about the runnels. So Here is the top of the property. The water comes from the adjacent land, comes down, and these are all of the bridges that you see. So there's this big, massive runnel here, and then there's another one here. This area right here is Lester's Pond. And so the runnels from here and here, kind of, this is our big intersection where there's a lot happening, and then they flow out down at the bottom of the property. They're really efficient and elegant. Even when it's pouring rain, we rarely have pooling in the paths. And Maggie, who, oh, here's just a picture of how efficiently they move. I think the idea was the contours of the landscape. You know, they move the water to reflect the landscape. They were designed to do that. And then occasionally there are these tributaries, I call them. So like this area is in our lower garden, down in our kind of Japanese garden area. And even when there's not a formal runnel there, the water chooses where to go. It doesn't just spread out. Like we were talking at dinner about how in some types of soil or clay, you know, the water just kind of disappears, and here it just makes itself known very clearly where it wants to go, and the runnels were designed to do that. Maggie, the second owner, had the runnels stoned. So before that, they were just literally ditches that would erode, and they'd have to dig them out. And so it took 2 years, but now the runnels are actually beautiful features of the garden that don't erode and really just create a nice visual look for the context of the water as it comes through. I don't know if this is gonna work, but I'm gonna try it. This is what they look like in the rain. I just find it so incredibly beautiful, and that there was this foresight to think about how to direct the water. Anyways, I keep saying the same thing over and over, but I'm blown away by the runnels. So that's a first story about the runnels. Let's see. Now I can't advance.
I think you need to reduce the photo.
Do you think I need to do what?
Reduce the photo.
Say it again.
Reduce the photo.
I can hear people mumbling, but I can't hear what they're saying. This guy? Oh, here's the bench. This is it. I did it. All you needed to do was walk up here and I found it. All right, second story is about the bench and what I was saying, an artifact that returned to its home. So Lester died in 1985. And he bequeathed the property, well, Lester dies in 1985 and Marshall dies in 1990. And Marshall bequeathed the property to Maggie Rich, this is her. She was a jeweler from the UK, and similar to Lester and Marshall, when they left San Francisco to move up to Occidental, they purchased the property for $2,300 with an inheritance that Marshall had gotten. They didn't know much about gardening at all and learned on the job. Same with Maggie. She was a jeweler. She was hired by Marshall as the water carrier because there was no electric irrigation. So she had to, you know, walk around the garden, move hoses, hand water things. But she became, well, she was a very quick study, and she became a very close confidant of Marshall's, particularly after Lester passed. So she owns the property for 17 years, and we have met many people who knew her well, who talk about kind of her influence on them and really she really cultivated this staunch group of supporters. She made a lot of improvements in addition to stoning the runnels, which I just showed you. She had this built, which is our folly, as you walk in the door. It's designed to mimic or reflect a beautiful structure by Penelope Hobhouse that was a favorite of hers. And she did a lot of planting around the folly. It's really hard to see in this end picture over here how much planting is on it, but the structure is almost covered here. She planted in particular one cutting that she didn't know. It was a very small dormant cutting, and she put it on the front of the folly. And it turns out that it is this show-stopping flowering wonder. It's huge. It goes from, the entire front up to the top of the folly. And it is a hydrangea, but it's a hydrangea cross, this Peruviana crossed with the ceratifolia. It looks to me, like I said, I'm not an expert on plants yet, but it looks to me like a peony. You know how peonies are got that type of covering, and then they break open, and then it breaks open to this pink wonder, and it spreads out, and it blooms a few times a year. So I'm hopeful that when you come in April, you'll get to see it. So Maggie made an incredible impact on the garden. The property thrived. The nursery exploded, but she didn't live there. So the buildings, particularly the house and the barn, and some of the outbuildings really deteriorated. And she didn't have the resources to develop them, and the nursery business wasn't doing as well, because I think somebody recently told me that she said that the advent of the internet was the beginning of the decline of Western Hills Garden. Just too hard to make a living off selling plants when you can just go online and order them and have them sent to you. So she finally was convinced to sell, and when she did, go back here just for a second. She gave a favorite bench to some friends of hers because she wasn't quite sure about Robert and Joseph. She was pretty worried that maybe they weren't going to be successful, which turns out they weren't. So she gives this bench to the friends, and it stays in their backyard for over a decade. And a few months after purchasing the property, this is the email that we get. We get emails like this quite a lot, actually, not specifically like this, but from people who say, we want to talk to you about something. So this is, we have something of yours. And so they bring this bench, which looks like this. We've put it next to the folly because we think it's a really nice marriage of the folly that Maggie built and this bench that you can see. We learned from some recent visitors, the one that was telling me about the hydrangea actually, and the fact that she didn't know what it was when it got planted, that bench used to live on the front porch of the main house. This is what the main house looked like around 1991. It looks completely different now because the folks that we bought the property from had it remodeled, with the exception of this room right here, which looks the same on the inside and outside, and we call it the chapel because it's pretty spectacular. I'll show it to you in a comment if you want to see it. And this is one of the things that makes it special, the fact that it had this gorgeous carving in it with the M and the L. And a friend of mine who's an artist decided that she needed to carve an H and a K for Hadley and Kent as well, so that we could, have an artifact that matched this. So we have the Marshall and Lester bench, and we have the Hadley and Kent carving. It's kind of a silly thing, but it's pretty special. One thing before I jump into this third story about the Acer Penaphyllum is that there are a lot of people, as in this room, who knew Lester and Marshall or Maggie or Chris and Tim, or been to the garden, and we really want to capture more of those stories. So we're looking for a grant to do some oral histories so that we can actually, preserve some of those stories from people before we can't get them anymore from folks. So that's something that we're looking into. All right, so this rare and important specimen, like I said, we bought the property from Chris and Tim Sabalski in 2021, and they had purchased it from the bank. They spent a lot of time and a lot of money clearing the land, making improvements to the structures that had not been lived in, for the 17 years that Maggie had the property. And their hard work and vision really enabled us to buy the property. There would have been no way that we would have had the energy or the resources or the wherewithal to take this on. So they bought the property out of foreclosure. Robert and Joseph, like I said, they bought it high. They didn't have the resources to fix it up, and they had really great intentions. They wanted to create a nonprofit. They wanted to get the Garden Conservancy involved, which they did. And they had, I think, a similar vision to us in that they wanted it to be a community resource, a place where, horticulturalists could come, but also the general public and enjoy being in the garden. So to this day, I really appreciate the work that they did. And, I'm sad that it didn't work out for them, but the connection that they made to the Garden Conservancy, like I said before, has continued and just was reinforced with a 2024 Garden Futures grant that we got from the Garden Conservancy. We're one of 23 gardens across the country that got this grant, and it wasn't a huge amount of money, $5,000, I think, but it was really rewarding for us, kind of as the new stewards of this space, to feel like an organization like the Garden Conservancy saw not only that we were trying to preserve the history of this, but that they were excited and supportive of our vision for the future. So this is the company that we're in, and that was just announced. So yeah, this is supposed to be a story about the Acer Penaphyllum. This is the Acer Penaphyllum right here, hanging over the nursery. So it's a small nursery right now, but we're working on growing it. So Chris and Tim have the property for 11 years. They put a lot of money into it. They rehab the houses. They put electric irrigation in. And they put in this kind of event center, common space. But then they decided after the pandemic to go live with their son and grandchild in Hawaii, because the son was like, maybe it's time to stop toiling and trying to make a botanical garden pencil and come and retire in Hawaii and spend time with your grandbaby. So I'm sure there were many other variables as well, but they said, okay, let's sell. So we saw the property because a friend of ours just kind of serendipitously sent us the listing. We were not looking to buy a botanical garden at all. And we came to visit, walked around, and 2 weeks later, we were in contract. So that is a whole other story, and not the story I'm telling right now. What I am going to tell you is that one of the first persons that came to peek over the fence was a guy named Michael Wenzel, who is the curator of living collections at the Sonoma Botanical Garden. We get people peering over the fence all the time, But this was the first one, and I'm like, oh, hi, I happen to be down, in this area. I'm like, who are you? Well, he's like, I'm Michael Wenzel, and I'm here to see your Acer phylum. Where's that? And he's like, it's right there. And I'm like, "Oh, great. Okay, let's talk about the Acer phylum then. So, do people know about the Acer phylum? Some of you. It's a really, really rare, special maple. And here's a botanical picture of it. It has 5 narrow, slender, long leaves, sometimes 7, but typically 5. It has the red, what is this called? This is I wrote it down here, petiole, is that what it's called? Thank you. I'm really not as ridiculous as I seem. I'm feeling ridiculous right now, but, so, and so that attaches obviously the leaf to the stem. It's a really, really striking, elegant specimen. And the trees were found on a National Geographic expedition in the 1930s by a plant explorer, agricultural explorer named Joseph Rock. He spent over 30 years in China, supported by all kinds of different organizations, largely from the US, collecting specimens and researching plants. And 3 of those Acer penaphyllums ended up at striving. It's been said to me, and I've read, that all Acer penaphyllum in the US are from these 3 plants that arrived at striving. This picture was taken by a guy whose name is William McNamara, and he was the president and executive director of a garden up in Sonoma County called Quarry Hill, that's now called Sonoma Botanical Garden. And he was also considered a very established plant hunter. He traveled to China a number of times trying to find this Acer penaphyllum in the wild because he was very curious about it. And it took him 3 tries, but he finally did. He wrote a really interesting article, if this story is at all of interest, in Pacific Court that you can look up. And the striving trees apparently didn't produce a lot of seed, I've heard. But there was a really important nurseryman whose name is Tuichi Demoto, and he was from Oakland originally, ended up in Hayward, and he had some success taking a cutting of one of the striving arboretum botanical space in Golden Gate Park, just to make sure everybody's with me. I'm sure you are. And he grafted it onto a sugar maple and had great success with not only growing the plant, but also having it produce seeds. And our Acer penaphyllum came from him, which is a pretty special story. We've since built relationship with Devil Mountain, who's taken some of our seeds, I think about, and had success in propagating about 200 Acer penaphyllums, trying to get them out into the world. And Nancy, there you are, also has taken some of our seeds and is working on propagating them in her nursery. So I have brought seeds for any and all of you that would like to take some Acer penaphyllum seeds home. They're over there on the counter with some little envelopes. So you can take a few if you'd like and give your hand at growing some. They're actually pretty easy to plant and propagate. Okay, let's see. Final story is this idea that we are trying to continue to focus on community. And so we reopened to the public in March of 2022. We bought the property in September, like I said. And my husband Kent made this little garland. It's like our version of the red tape. And the first person that came through which I don't think was a coincidence. This is one of Maggie's closest friends. And she came and she cut the ribbon and she walked around the garden and we all kind of wept and felt great about the fact that we were once again reopened to the public. We are now offering day visits and tours, a bunch of different types of programs to get people really engaged in the nature of the space and how it could inspire them to all the things that I talked about with our mission, explore creativity, come up with new ideas, stretch themselves and take risks in different ways. The other thing I want to say is that we're really committed to small kind of contemplative programming. We don't really want to do big weddings, for example, or giant community events. We really want, because the space is small and the collection is so dense that it seems to lend itself for more depth and more intensive experiences. So that's where we are headed. We just hired our first full-time position, which is incredible. This is our horticulture manager, Justin Berthum, and we had a very esteemed hiring committee for Justin. Jim Salyers graciously agreed to participate, and Dick Turner and Beth Flack. And they screened all the applicants, and Justin, well, he doesn't have as deep of horticulture knowledge, is a really great addition because of his varied skill set and his enthusiasm. And we just love him. He's a great hire. Before that, it was Kent and I working pro bono with Howell, who is our lead gardener. He's been with the property 17 years. So he started working at Western Hills during the Robert and Joseph era, before the property went into foreclosure. So he's the one that really laid most of the irrigation when we did the electric, when Chris and Tim did the electric irrigation. He's seen the plants in their decline and, in their regeneration over the last couple decades. So he worked 3 days a week and still does. And then we have an incredible group of volunteers who have been coming. They come every Tuesday. Many of them, including Janet Bear right here. She's the head of the Sonoma County Master Gardeners Association. This is her sister-in-law, Jude, who's also a master gardener. And this is Dick Miner. I don't know if any of you know Dick Miner, but he's kind of a superstar. He comes and he does our compost. He's a retired microbiologist. So every Tuesday he's there chipping and turning. And then every Thursday he takes the boat over to Alcatraz and he does the same thing for the Alcatraz gardens. We just visited him there, Dustin and I, and another volunteer a couple weeks ago. That was a really special day. So what else? I'm almost done, you guys, but I'm just enjoying telling you these stories. So what we want to do is to continue to be a public refuge, place for creative expression and education and learning. We're launching school-based programming this spring. Justin, in addition to his many things that he knows how to do, was a high school teacher for 12 years. He taught environmental sciences at a high school in San Francisco and started their whole school garden program. So he's going to be great at the school-based programming side. Like I said, we're convening a horticultural advisory committee, and because of Kat's work, we're going to be able to apply for official arboretum status. We're going for level 2 to start. So hopefully we'll get that grant so that we can do some more of the things that we need to do to get that status. And then once we get more of our plants inventory, we can go for official botanical garden status. Yeah, we're really about holding up the past while kind of looking forward to having more and more people come and visit over the future. This is an Edgeworthia that are just getting ready to bloom right now. That was taken about a week ago. Yeah, just to sink in, to experience the wonder and wisdom and the risk that everybody that's touched this place have created. That's it's over there on the right that was telling you about where we do a lot of programming. You can see the stand of redwoods in the distance. That's borrowed view. That's on the neighbor's land. So this is our eastern redbud. And a nice place to kind of wrap up. I'm excited for you guys to come visit in April. We'd love you to share any of your ideas or your stories or anything that this sparked. And you know, if you're interested in more information about becoming a supporter, happy to talk about that. We're trying to get some funding so that we can offer, right now it's $10 suggested donation to come visit the garden, but we really just want to make it open for free to people. So we're raising some funds for that. And I want to leave you with 3 final key thoughts from Marshall Olbrich. This is an article that he wrote and that was published posthumously. And he's kind of reflecting on everything that he's learned over the 30+ years that he and Lester stewarded the land. And I'm just going to put his picture up there so you can see him as I read a few of his final words. He says, since we are concerned here with movements and revolutions in time, the image of the garden as a sort of giant clockwork comes to mind, with the large wheels, which are the trees and shrubs, revolving slowly over a period of decades. The smaller gears, shorter lived woody plants, revolving over years. And the smallest perennials and receding annuals whirling about it in months or weeks. The bite of time is more painful to some gardens than to others, but it is uniformly fatal to us. How are we to regard the interplay, the syncopation between the movement and life of the garden and of the gardener? Gardening is a costly and time-consuming activity, and the garden is a temporary work of art. The emotional effect of the garden derives precisely from this poignancy, akin to that of seeing dancers or of hearing singers, and knowing that they will not be tomorrow what they are today. The gardener's life is not shortened by the garden because the garden is not a timeless paradise, but as vulnerable and mortal as ourselves. The answer probably is not to be found in philosophical reflection, but in weeding and watering. There is so much to be done, so much to anticipate. Long before his final illness, Lester Hawkins wrote the briefest and most apposite epitaph for himself and other gardeners. He said, gardeners always have something to look forward to. On the final day, alas, this will still be true. So I look forward to continuing to share the story of Western Hills with you and others. Thank you again. Does anybody have a question, or should we turn it over to the rep? State champ? National champ? Okay, we're the national champ. Are you flip this review? You'll see it. Thank you for sharing that.
Do you know anything about the putting the stones in the runnels? That seems like a huge job.
Huge.
The pictures that you showed indicated that the stones are like drywalls along both banks of
Yes.
the runnels.
Yes, and
How
that's
many linear feet is that, do you think?
I don't know. That's a great question. We could do that calculation. But yeah, I mean, it was 2 years, and it was a man that had his name, and I can't recall it off the top of my head, but he was working with Maggie, and he was just like, Maggie, we need to stone the runnels. And he just set out to do it. And 2 years of toil and lifting, and they don't fall like they're, I don't know. It's amazing. Yeah.
I just want to say that Western Hills was a very impactful garden for me in my early days in horticulture, and that's one of the reasons why I was so honored to be a part of the hiring committee when Hadley and Kent asked. But when we visit, I'm hoping to visit a private garden before Western Hills, and I highly recommend if you're driving on your own to take that drive on Pullman Valley Road. It's one of the most stunning drives in the world. It really is. When you come out of the redwood forest and start getting views of the coast, high above the Pacific, it's breathtaking. I've done it probably 40 times in my life. I'll go out there, or I won't even go to Western Hills. If I'm in Sonoma County, I've driven from Healdsburg, staying in Healdsburg, and driven out so I can do that ride. It's breathtaking. Yeah. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, Hog Hill is the name of the other garden that I'm hoping us to visit in April. I'll also say on while I was sitting back there, I got on the Western Hills website and started a regular donation to the garden. And I as horticulturists and people who want to support gardens, I just think it's a nice thing to do. So that's my 2 cents.
Wow, thank you. That's really special to hear. Hog Hill, by the way, is linked to Western Hills and that Mary Reed. So Hog Hill is owned by Lou and Mary Reed. They were some early folks who showed up and told us their story. And Mary, they're both in their 90s, I think, or late 80s. And Mary worked closely with Maggie. She was learning to be a landscaper and did a lot of propagation. And their property is in a little bit different microclimate. They're inland, not very far, a few miles, but up on a higher hill that has much more sunlight, especially because their trees are not as mature as ours are. And they propagated a lot of stuff from Maggie. Maggie would send them home with cuttings and they would grow them there. So a lot of the things that you'll see if you get to go there have origins at Western Hills as well.
Those of us who've never grown a maple seed, can you kind of give us a quick, or maybe Nancy?
Nancy, tell us your secrets.
I put them in a mixture of sand and peat moss, moist, not dripping wet, not dry, in the refrigerator for 3 months. But if you want to do it now, do it for a month. And then have a seed pan of fairly deep soil. Put the seeds on top. Barely cover them with soil, and then I put gravel on top of that. That keeps, when you water the watering, that means all the seeds don't end up in one end of the container. And then keep them outside. Keep the birds off of them.
And do we just take one thing seeds here to do that, or?
I mean, I
You
brought
have a lot.
I brought a
There's
ton.
a
It's
lot.
so prolific. You can take as many as you like.
I don't have.
You ended
that.
It takes a long time.
Do you keep them in the
refrigerator first
and then keep it outside?
You put them in the, so you